She walked into that clinic with a baby in a yellow blanket and $43 in her pocket. She had come for a routine checkup with her 3 weeks-old baby. She filled out the form, took a seat, and waited. When the midwife came in, she unwrapped the blanket, turned the baby's head gently to the side, and looked behind the right ear. Her hand stopped. The room went quiet. And the midwife, 71 years old, 35 years in delivery rooms, sat down on a rolling stool and covered her face and wept. The mother looked up. "What's wrong? What's wrong with her?" The midwife lifted her face from her hands. Her voice came out unsteady. "Your baby is fine. Then why are you?" The midwife reached out and touched Wren's wrist. "I need you to listen to me. Before you say anything else. All of it. Can you do that?" She had seen that mark before. 3 weeks ago. In Columbus. On a different baby. Wren Adler was 24 years old. She grew up in Cincinnati in a small house where the gutters stayed clogged through October, and the answer to most problems was to get up earlier and work harder. Her mother had been a cashier at the same grocery store for 22 years. She never complained. Complaining used energy she couldn't spare. Wren took notes. By 20 she had held 4 jobs. By 22 she had saved enough for a domestic staffing course and a placement in Columbus, Ohio. It wasn't what she had imagined, but it was steady, and steady was what she understood. The Harmon estate sat behind iron gates on a street where the driveways were sealed every 2 years, and the trees were shaped by someone whose only job was shaping trees. Cleet Harmon was 48. He had grown up the son of a roofer in Akron and turned sharp instincts and harder work into a commercial real estate empire worth hundreds of millions. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had grown very large and very comfortable, and those two things together have a way of making a person stop looking closely at anything that might require them to act. He had a habit of noticing things and then deciding very quickly that they were probably fine. His wife, Opal, was 46. She ran the household with total control. The warmth she might have once carried had been worn down by 15 years of dinner table remarks, and the cruelty of people who say things just loud enough to be heard. She had survived all of it without breaking, which made her formidable, which had also cost her something she would not put a name to. The thing she would not name. She and Cleet had never been able to have children. 15 years. No children. That fact had followed them into every room they ever shared, every holiday, every dinner party, every boardroom conversation that circled back anyway. Opal had learned to keep her face flat. She had learned to be someone nobody dared to challenge because control was the only battlefield she had left. Wren learned this on day 1. Rue Vantel, the head housekeeper, pulled her aside before the morning was over. Rue was a Dayton woman in her late 50s, flat shoes, quiet voice. She kept her voice low. "Stay invisible. Do your work. Go to your room. Don't become a person to anyone here." It wasn't unkind. It was the truth, and Wren accepted it. For 14 months, she was invisible. The problem was Cleet. He sat in the kitchen after 11 most nights. He said once that it was the only room in the house that felt like somewhere a person actually lived. The rest of it, the hallways, the formal rooms, the framed art, felt like a photograph of a house. He said this casually. Wren heard what was underneath it. He was lonely. In a house that large and that quiet, it was impossible to miss. She didn't pursue it. But loneliness, when it is that constant, finds the cracks. By November, Wren was sitting on the edge of her bed with the positive pregnancy test in her hand, looking at the wall. She had not told Cleet. She was still working out what to say. Then she heard Opal's voice from the sitting room. Wren was in the hallway with a stack of folded towels. The door was cracked. She wasn't trying to listen. But Opal was speaking about a woman named Petra, a former maid, and what she was saying stopped Wren where she stood. Opal described, in a flat and unhurried voice, how she had handled it. The staffing agency complaint. The call to the next employer. The conversation with the landlord. "Any woman in this house who takes something that belongs to me," she said, "will not simply lose her job. She will lose the one after that. She will spend a very long time trying to get back to zero." No heat, no drama, just information. Wren stood in the hallway and understood exactly what she was carrying and exactly what it would cost. Opal would not come after Cleet. Cleet was hers. What Opal would come after was the thing that threatened what was hers. She would come after Wren's ability to work, her ability to rent, her ability to find the next job, and the one after that. She had just described, calmly and in detail, exactly how she had done it before, and she had said it to a room she believed was empty, which meant she said it the way people say things they have no doubt about. Wren was 4 feet away with a pregnancy test already in her trash bin upstairs. She thought about the baby. She thought about what it would mean to be blacklisted, unemployed, broke, and pregnant with Cleet Harmon's child, while Opal Harmon systematically ensured that no agency, no employer, no landlord would give her a second look. She thought about what it would mean to fight that from inside this house, in a uniform, with no one on her side. She went to her room. She pulled the bag from the top shelf. She did not pace. She did not cry. She folded things into it steadily, without waste, without ceremony, doing what needed to be done before anyone had the opportunity to make it harder. She was out of the house before midnight and on the first bus out of Columbus, which was going to Dayton. She got on it. Dayton in February does not greet you warmly. Wren arrived at 2 a.m. with one bag, $80, and an address for a cousin who had moved away 2 years earlier without leaving a forwarding number. She sat in the bus station until 4. The woman at the next seat overlooked at her belly and then looked away. Nobody asked if she was all right. She did not need them to. Then she walked. By the end of that first week, a room on Fenton Street, $220 a month, a woman named Gessel Pruitt who asked no questions, a night shift cleaning job at an office building downtown, 3 mornings a week stocking shelves at a grocery warehouse on Route 35, rice and eggs, a mason jar on the counter she filled and never touched unless she had to. She learned the bus routes in 4 days. She learned which shifts paid 30 cents more per hour. She learned that the discount rack at the grocery 2 blocks over got restocked on Tuesday evenings, and if you arrived by 7, you could get bread. She applied the same attention to surviving that she had once applied to keeping a house immaculate, without complaint, without theater, without waiting for anyone to notice. Every night before she slept, she placed her palm against her belly and talked. She told her baby about the day, the cold loading dock, the bus ride home, the things they were going to do when she was old enough. She just talked. It was the most important thing she did all day. She did not contact Cleet. If Opal found out, the consequences would not land on him. They would land on Wren, on the baby. She had stood 4 feet from a cracked door and learned exactly what those consequences looked like. So she stayed silent, kept adding to the jar, and moved forward one day at a time. What she did not know, what no one had told her, was that she was carrying twins. She delivered at Dayton Regional Medical Center on a Thursday in February after a 9-hour labor. She gripped the bed rail and breathed the way they told her to breathe. At the end of it, a baby girl arrived, and the sound she made filled every corner of that room. Wren lay back against the pillow. "Is she okay?" she said. The nurse said she was perfect. Wren closed her eyes. She held her daughter for the first time and felt something she did not have a word for, not relief. Exactly, though it was that. Not joy, though it was that too. Something more complete than either of those. Something that felt like the only solid ground she had stood on in months. She named her Lul. She held her and slept 6 hours and woke up and held her again. She did not know about the second baby. The records showed 1 delivery, 1 patient, 1 baby. As far as Dayton Regional Medical Center was concerned, that was the whole story. It was not the whole story. Later, much later, she would think back to the hours after Lul was born. A nurse had come back twice about paperwork. Not the regular nurse, a different one, older and in a calm manner. She stood at the door and said there was a billing discrepancy on the intake form. Just 1 more signature to clear it up. Routine, she said. Wren had been awake for 24 hours. She had just given birth alone. Her daughter was in her arms, and she was the most exhausted she had ever been in her life, and the woman said, "Routine," and Wren signed where she pointed without reading a word. She would think about that. She would understand later that that was exactly what she was supposed to do. A woman arriving alone. No partner. No family. A woman who had already learned to take up as little space as possible. She was not a difficult case. She was exactly what they looked for. She would also think about the face in the doorway. Second night. A woman she had never seen. White-haired, small, standing in the half-open door. Looking at the room. Looking at the baby. Gone before Wren fully registered it. She had been exhausted. She had her daughter. She did not ask. She would think about that face for a long time. Beth Voss had been running Dayton Regional's maternity ward for 11 years. A quiet operation on the side. She had been running long enough that she had stopped examining it clearly. She found the mothers the same way every time. Young, unconnected, no family in the waiting room, no partner on the intake form. She had done it 4 times before Wren. Each time, paperwork adjusted, money moved through a paper foundation that existed on a document and nowhere else, baby transferred within 48 hours. She called it placement assistance. The call connecting Bet to the Harmon family had come 8 months before Wren delivered. It had come from Foss Stringer. Foss Stringer was 71, white-haired, small, with hands that moved with the muscle memory of 35 years of midwifery across 3 Ohio counties. She had delivered babies in rooms where the worst things happened, and she had stayed steady and kept her hands moving. That was who she was. That was the whole shape of her life. She was also a mother who had watched her daughter carry a grief she could not fix for 15 years, and on a morning she would spend the rest of her life trying to understand. She decided that was a good enough reason. One morning she picked up the phone. She found the number through careful conversation, through the soft language of people who had learned to say things without quite saying them. She made the call. She arranged the transfer. She spent the months that followed watching her daughter hold that baby and telling herself she had done a good thing. Then she drove to Dayton for her Tuesday shift at the Clover Street Clinic, 3 weeks after the baby arrived in Columbus. And Wren Adler walked in with a baby in a pale yellow blanket and asked to see someone for a checkup. The clinic on Clover Street smelled like antiseptic and old carpet, orange plastic chairs, a fluorescent light that buzzed when the heat kicked on. It did the work without the budget and kept doing it. Foss knocked twice and opened the door to the 3rd intake. A young woman sat on the exam table with a baby in her arms. Dark circles. Calm face. She looked up and said, "Good morning." Foss introduced herself, asked the baby's name. The young woman looked down at the bundle in her arms, then back up. "Lul. That's beautiful." Foss pulled on her gloves and reached for the baby. "Standard 3-week check. Weight, length, and we'll look her over." She went through it in order. Weight, length, eyes, palate, muscle tone, heart. Then she turned the baby's head gently to check behind the ears. She saw the mark, a faint crescent shape, behind the right ear, small and pale, positioned exactly where she had seen it 3 weeks ago on a different baby, in a different city, in the arms of a different woman. Her hand stopped. She looked at the mark. She looked at the baby's face. She looked at the young woman on the exam table. 24 years old, dark circles, $43 in a jar at home, who had signed a form she couldn't read because she had been awake for 24 hours and her newborn was in her arms and she had trusted the calm woman with the clipboard. This woman, right here, this was the mother, and 35 years of staying steady gave way all at once. She sat down on the rolling stool. She put her face in her hands, and she wept. "What's wrong? What's wrong with her?" Foss wiped her face with both hands and looked up. "Your baby is fine. Lul is completely fine." "Then why?" "I need you to listen to me." Foss lifted her face fully, eyes red but voice steadying. "All of it. Before you say anything else." Wren looked at her. Then she nodded. Foss told her, not gently. There was a second baby. Wren did not speak. She looked at Foss. She waited. Foss kept her eyes on Wren. She did not look away. Born the same night. Same hospital. Same delivery. You had twins and nobody told you. The fluorescent light buzzed. Somewhere down the hall, a baby was crying. Wren looked down at Lul, then back up. "Where is she?" The second baby, a girl, the same crescent mark behind the right ear, had been moved out of Dayton Regional within 48 hours of the birth. Not lost. Not a mistake. The paperwork had been adjusted. The records showed 1 delivery, 1 patient, one baby, because someone with access to those records had made sure that was what they showed. It had been done carefully. It had been done before. Her name was Bet Voss, maternity ward administrator. She had been doing this for years, finding mothers who were alone, unconnected, too exhausted to read what they were signing, and finding wealthy families who would pay for what she could provide. She had done it 4 times before Wren. Each time a baby was gone before the mother had any reason to ask a question. Wren's hands tightened around Lul. The baby was in Columbus, 3 weeks old. She had been given a name. She was alive. She was in a house Wren already knew by heart. How do you know all of this? Foss told the last piece. She had made the call. 8 months before Wren delivered. She had contacted Bet Voss. She had arranged the transfer. She had set it in motion before Wren ever set foot in Dayton, before Wren even knew she was pregnant. She had done it for her daughter. Her daughter's name was Opal. Her son-in-law's name was Cleet. 15 years of a grief she could not fix, and a mother who decided one morning that love was a good enough reason. Foss looked at her hands in her lap. She did not look up when she spoke. I told myself I was connecting a need to a solution. I told myself the baby would go somewhere with every advantage. I told myself my daughter deserved to stop hurting. She looked up then, directly at Wren. What I did was take your child while you were still in that hospital asking if she was okay. The room was quiet. Wren sat with Lul in her arms. The hall sounds continued outside the door. A rolling cart, a voice at the front desk, a baby somewhere crying. The world outside that room kept moving. Wren did not. She had just been told that she delivered twins, and no one told her. That a woman had stood at the door of her hospital room with a clipboard and waited until she was too exhausted to read. That a white-haired woman had stood in a half-open doorway and looked at her baby, and Wren had been too tired to ask why. That 8 months before any of this happened, before she had even arrived in Dayton, before she had even known she was pregnant, a phone call had already been made about her child. She let all of it arrive. She did not push it away, and she did not perform anything about it. She sat with it the way she sat with everything that had been too large and too real to do anything except accept and decide. Wren looked at Foss. Something cold and precise had settled in her face. She had received the information. She had processed it. She was already on the other side of it. She's alive. Her voice was level. My other daughter. She's alive and she's in Columbus. Yes. Wren looked down at Lul, at the face she had memorized in the dark, during 9 hours when there was no one else in the room, the face she had talked to every night through a belly and a boarding house wall. She pressed her lips to the top of her daughter's head. One breath. Then she looked up. Take me to her. Foss drove. Wren sat in the passenger seat with Lul in a borrowed car seat behind her. An hour and 40 minutes. Maybe 30 words between them the whole drive. The highway was gray and flat, bare Ohio trees on either side. Wren kept one hand on the door handle and thought. When things were hard, she went quiet and worked through every step and decided what came next. It had carried her out of Cincinnati and through 14 months behind iron gates and through 9 hours alone in a delivery room and through 3 months on Fenton Street. It would carry her through this. She thought about Cleet. She thought about the version of himself he had been building for 3 months, the version where she had simply left, where he had not known, where he could not have been expected to act. She thought about how comfortable that version must have felt, how much work it must have taken to maintain it, how it would look when she was standing in front of him and none of the pieces held anymore. She did not feel sorry for him. She thought about what she was going to say, not the emotion of it, the structure of it. She worked through it the way she worked through everything. Find the center, say it plainly. Do not let him talk you into smaller words. These are your daughters. This is what you owe them. This is where we start. That was all she needed. She would not call ahead. Cleet Harmon was a man who had chosen every single morning for 3 months not to ask a question he already sensed the answer to, and she wanted to be standing in front of him before he had time to build another story about why that was fine. The iron gates came into view, the shaped trees, the sealed driveway. Wren looked at all of it and felt nothing she hadn't already decided to feel. Ring the bell. Rue Vantel answered the door. Recognition, confusion, dread. She stepped aside without a word. She had worked in this house for 8 years. She knew what a door that should not have opened looked like. Cleet came out of his office and stopped in the hallway. He looked at Wren. He looked at the baby in her arms. He looked at the white-haired woman standing just behind her. He said nothing. He had built something careful over the 3 months since she left. She had left without notice. People did that sometimes, he had told himself. It was not his fault he hadn't known her situation. He could not have been expected to look for someone who left without telling him why. He had not, in 3 months, allowed himself to think about the fact that she had been visibly pregnant in October, that she had disappeared in November, that the math of those two facts was not complicated. He had been a man who had a habit of noticing things and deciding very quickly that they were probably fine. Standing in the hallway of his own house looking at Wren Adler standing on his doorstep with a baby in her arms and 3 months of silence behind her, every piece of what he had built came apart. Not slowly, all at once. The way a thing collapses when it was never solid to begin with. Wren stepped past him into the hallway. There's something all of you need to hear. Opal came down the stairs holding a baby in a white sleeper. Wren saw her from across the room. She saw the baby. There is no word for what moved through her. Not pain, not relief, not recognition, though it was all three. Something older than language. She looked at that baby's face from across the sitting room and she knew. Bone deep. Immediate. The same way she had known the first time a nurse laid Lul against her chest. Opal came into the room. She sat in the chair by the window and held her baby and waited. She was 46 years old and had survived things that should have broken her. She was not going to break now in front of these people in her own house. Voss spoke. She told it in order. The phone call. That Voss. The hospital. The Thursday evening in February when a baby arrived at this house wrapped in a hospital blanket and was given the name Edie. She did not soften a word of it. She looked at Cleet and at Opal and at Rue standing near the door, and she told all of it plainly, because plain was the only way left. Cleet sat with his elbows on his knees and stared at the floor. His face moved through something slow, and when it came out the other side, he looked older than he had when Voss began. Not destroyed. Older. The look of a man who has run out of space between himself and what he chose not to know. Rue stayed near the door. She had worked in this house for 8 years. She stood there as a witness. Opal listened to every word without moving. When Voss finished, Opal looked at her mother across the room. Her voice was quiet and precise. You did this for me. Voss's hands tightened in her lap. She did not look away. I thought I was. Something shifted in Opal's face, not into anger, but into something older. The look of a woman who has just understood, completely and too late, what it costs for someone to love her. She looked down at the baby. The small nose, the closed fists, the short, even breathing she had watched every night for 3 weeks with something she had let herself, for the first time in 15 years, call joy. She understood, sitting there, that the love was real. That none of what she felt had been a lie. That you can love something honestly that arrived through a lie, and that this is one of the cruelest things a person can discover about themselves. She sat with that. Nobody spoke. Nobody filled it. Then she stood up. She kissed the baby's forehead. She pressed her face against that small, warm head. Eyes closed, one hand cupped around the back of that tiny skull. Whatever she said it there. In that space. Only to the baby. Then she straightened and held her out to Wren. Wren crossed the room and took her daughter. She held Lul in one arm, and the baby Opal had named Edie in the other. She stood in the center of that sitting room, the room she had vacuumed and kept invisible in for 14 months, and looked down at both of them. Her daughters, side by side. For the first time, Opal picked up the bag she had set beside her chair before she came downstairs. She looked at Cleet. The look of a woman who has read the last page and finally understood what 15 years of it added up to. She walked past him, past Rue, through the front hallway and out the door. She got in her car and drove. The door closed behind her. The house was quiet in a way it had not been before. Not the quiet of a controlled household, but the quiet of a room after something irreversible has happened in it. She did not look back. She had spent 15 years in a marriage that had, on a Thursday evening in February, produced this morning. She was done. Her leaving was not a loss. It was the most deliberate thing she did in this entire story. The clearest, most self-possessed moment she had, and she took it without hesitating, without theater, without asking anyone's permission. She had nothing left to prove to anyone in the room she was walking out of. She drove until the iron gates were behind her, and then she kept driving. And for the first time in 15 years, the road ahead belonged entirely to her. Cleet sat across from Wren, not beside her, across, the coffee table between them. He looked at his daughters in her arms. He looked at their faces. He looked at a woman who had cleaned every room in his house for 14 months and then left before midnight with one bag. And he had told himself she left because people sometimes do, as if the timing of it, right after she found out she was carrying his child, was something he had genuinely failed to consider. He took one breath. I didn't look for you. He kept his eyes on his daughters, not on Wren. When you left, I didn't look. Wren watched him. No, you didn't. He took that straight. No edge. No cushion. They're mine. He looked up then. Both of them. Yes. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. And I failed you. He said it plainly, not as a performance, just as a fact he had arrived at and was choosing to say out loud instead of finding a way around. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. I'm not going to put something on this table and call it enough. Wren looked at him for a long moment. You don't fix this today. Not with one conversation. Not with one check. These girls deserve a father who shows up every ordinary day. Not when it's convenient, not when it feels meaningful. Every day. That's what you owe them. He held her gaze. I know that. Then that's where we start. Not with a gesture. Just there. He nodded. He did not reach across the table. He understood that the distance between them was not something a sentence could close, and that a woman who had worked 2 jobs and eaten rice and eggs and talked to her baby through a boarding house wall for 3 months did not owe him a faster timeline than the one she set herself. Foss sat in the armchair by the door and said nothing. She had delivered more than 800 babies. She had been the first person in the room for more arrivals than she could count. She had sat with mothers in the worst hours of their lives, and she had stayed, and she had helped, and she had believed for 35 years that a life built on that was a life that meant something. She watched Wren sit across from Cleet Harmon, 24 years old, a daughter on each arm, 3 months of rice and eggs, and $43 in a jar behind her, and she understood something she had not understood when she made that call. She had been looking at the baby. She had not been looking at the mother. She had seen a need and called it a solution. She had arranged everything carefully, through quiet conversations and careful language, and she had never once stopped to look at the 24-year-old woman who would wake up in that hospital room alone and ask if her daughter was okay and be told yes, she's perfect, and believe completely and incorrectly that she had one child. She had used 35 years of trust to do it. She had used the muscle memory of 10,000 examinations and the calm manner of a woman who had never once looked away in a hard room. She had used all of it. People would argue about Foss for a long time after this. Some would say she loved too hard. Some would say love was not the right word for what she did. Some would say there was no version of what she did that deserved a gentler name than theft. Foss herself would never resolve it. She would carry it, too heavy to put down and too shameful to ask for help with. She would carry it for the rest of her life, which was, she understood sitting in that armchair, exactly right. The quiet woman, she thought. You always miscalculate the quiet women. Lil made a small sound. Not a cry. Just presence. The baby Opal had called. Edie turned her head toward it. Not slowly. Immediately. Somewhere beneath the different houses and different names and the 60 miles between their births, beneath every decision every adult in that room had made, she turned toward her sister's voice. And Wren looked down at both of them in her arms and exhaled. Thank you for watching. If this story reached something in you, press the like button right now and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to the Storytelling King so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you are watching from. Are you in Ohio, London, Jamaica, Nigeria, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, the Philippines? We read every single one. We will see you in the next story.